his remarks. Very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm pleased to introduce Mayor Cooper to join us this evening.
Oh, well, thank you. It's good to see all of you all. By the way, I think the virus news, I'm looking forward to doing this in person. I think the city's going to do 100,000 shots this month. We're sort of 200,000 into it. If April picks up even from where we are, I think for sure by this summer you see the end of it. And then we can get back to normal. But so grateful that you all are here. The city is waiting for your answers. All right, so have good ones. But thank you for being part of the task force. You're meeting on a weekly basis, and you're working hard, and you're beginning to think all this through, and I'm grateful for that. And the city's going to be grateful for the conclusions that you reach. And I'm excited to get them and to have a good coordinated work product here. I'm really grateful to each one of you getting that done. Now, I wanted to show up and thank you, but also to address a subject that has been bothering me a lot for the past year. And that's when funds were impounded to balance the FY 2020 budget, I made a commitment that those funds would be restored. And today I would like to share good news. We're immediately restoring the impounded $5 million to the Barnes Fund. And we're going to use half of the governor's grant to the city to do that. I know it's important to our housing committee. It's been important to me. It's kind of weighed on me over the last period of COVID, but the city, I think, is getting back to normal, and this is a moment to appreciate that. And let me just finish by appreciating your work again. I know it's hard to show up in cyberspace from time to time and work on a difficult subject to create a solution to any city's sort of hardest problem. So I'm grateful to everything that you are doing. And again, I don't want to deter you from getting back to work, but let me just appreciate each of you. I do think your work, if I can have a special plea, that a lot is going to go on in the city in the next few months and in the next year that creates a opportunity for affordable housing solutions. And so you all being ahead of that with practical, realizable answers to these questions is going to be very timely for the city. Nashville's growth has never been stronger. This year we will have, I believe, almost $5 billion in construction permits. I remember 7 or 8 years ago, we crossed $1 billion for the first time and thought that was huge and probably would never be repeated. Now we'll come in just under $5 billion. I think the pipeline is such that that can probably continue. So with each $1 billion of construction permits comes a challenge to the population that lives here to not be displaced, to stay here, to have it be affordable. The growth is great, but it's going to make the work of this committee even more important and even harder to do. So with that, on to your work. Thank you all. I want to wave at Sulfat, who I see over there in the corner. That's always good. In particular, to see our valued at-large council members. But thank you all for being part of this process, and I'm grateful to every one of you. Appreciate it, Dia. Okay, thank you. Good work.
Thank you, Mayor Cooper. Well, that's a tough act to follow. Thanks, everyone, for being here for that announcement. I think that's very exciting news. I can see that Councilwoman Suara is delighted with that news. So it's always good to start a meeting on a high note. And so now we get to really jump into the thick of things. Kenya, would you be kind enough to send me the ball? And I'm just going to walk through our agenda tonight and just a couple of items as we get going. I appreciate the mayor's very timely comments and the fact that he's going to allow us to stick to our agenda You can imagine that that makes me extraordinarily happy. Kenya, when you get a chance, can you move the ball from Kelsey to me? Well, as I'm waiting for the ball, there we go. Thanks so much for moving the ball. And so I just wanted to take a moment to just sort of walk through our guidelines. We talked about these at the beginning of the task force, and now that we're really getting into discussions, I think it's important to dust them off and remember where we stand with these. You know, the first guideline really around the Open Meetings Act is that the Open Meetings Act provides the task force guidance on how we want to conduct our conversations. So of course, any recommendations or any selection of recommendations should be discussed during these recordings for the benefit of public attendees. That said, it is perfectly acceptable to have any members of the task force talk to each other about emerging recommendations, to fine tune them, to ask questions, to you know, make them more specific, of course. So that can absolutely happen offline. Next, so important that everyone can have a chance to speak during the meetings, and that happens when we respect the time and the agenda. We've got 90-minute meetings set up primarily because we understand that the virtual environment is not terribly hospitable to lengthy conversations. So we want to use your time in the highest and best possible way. And we appreciate you taking the time to serve on the task force. We also know that around the table, everybody has different discussion and presentation styles, and we need to be very sensitive to that. So for members who are listeners, consider speaking more, and for members who are talkers, consider listening more. We know who you are, so we will be monitoring the conversation, and I'll have a chance to be sure to reach back out to folks if we don't hear from you. Remember, in a virtual environment, that the general rule is silence is considered agreement. So if there's no comment or conversation or question on an issue, we will move to the next one. So most certainly speak up if you disagree. And if you disagree, we welcome comments specifically on the topic and the subject matter. You know, I support that kind of lively debate. And then finally, as we move to the decision-making process, we can always use Robert's Rules of Order to take a vote on consensus. So those are the guidelines that we put together at the beginning of the task force. If there are other guidelines that any of you are interested in adding to that list, please feel free to email me. So in terms of today's agenda, as you know, in the beginning of February, we spent some time really developing a working goal. That working goal right now is Nashville housing options are affordable, accessible, and available to all Nashvillians. How do we define that? What is the target in that? That really depends on the indicators that we select to measure those issues of affordable, accessible, and available to all Nashvillians. So right now, some of the working indicators that we have on deck in the level set packet that Greg Claxton has been so generous to put together for us include the supply gap, as well as a housing affordability metric, okay? We will be updating these in the next few weeks to really hone in on perhaps some of the best proxy data that we can get our hands on during the time of the task force. That said, I just want to cover roles very quickly. For members around the table, your role is to contribute ideas and ask questions. For co-chairs around the table, we are really looking to you to help us identify blind spots and missing information and to help clarify information. What will happen over the next few weeks is that This week and next week will be dedicated to focusing on round one recommendations. Round one recommendations are all in. That is, we want a full comprehensive list of recommendations. We will also be taking a look at these recommendations and making sure that they are categorized not only by functional area, taxing, zoning, etc., but also by theme. It's the thematic coherence that helps us build strategies. So we'll be doing that this week and next week. After that, we will swap recommendations with the other subcommittees so we can take a look at their work and see what else we would want to add. And then finally, as we head into April, we will identify what are high impact recommendations through a ranking process and an evaluation process. And then at the beginning of April, if we need to, we might facilitate a small in-person meeting. The mayor shared some good news as vaccines roll out, but we still need to be sure that any in-person meeting we conduct is consistent with MPHD's policies around group meetings. So now to the issue at hand. Part of the results-based accountability is taking a look at recommendations so that they reflect the contributions of all subcommittee members. That we also flag what might be low or no cost items. This is clearly not the mayor's request, but rather just a criteria that is done regularly so that we understand what could be easy to do, the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Also flagging items where resources can be used differently to get better results. And we want to flag where we need more information, research, or data. Part of the report will identify key areas for additional research and data. We know we don't have all the right data at our fingertips today. So we expect that there will be at least an appendix with that list on data. And then finally, I invite anyone to make a recommendation on an off-the-wall item. So if there are big ideas, robust ideas, I think you should put them on the table. But tonight, I am delighted to say that your co-chair, Kelsey Osman, has done a lot of work on the list of recommendations that were sent out this morning and has a concept map to share with us. And so our discussion is really going to focus on the structure of that concept map. And so Kelsey, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask that Kenya turn the ball over to you so we can begin that discussion. Kenya, while Kelsey is pulling up her screen, can you move Paulette Coleman to serve as a panelist? She's currently an attendee. Very good. Thank you so much. Take it away, Kelsey.
Thanks, Dia. So I personally am a very visual thinker. In going through the list of recommendations that y'all had contributed to the document on SharePoint, this was my way of starting to pull out some trends and sort of buckets of ideas. So in this map in Miro, the colors represent sort of AMI targeting, and you'll notice that there's a lot of yellow that applies to all levels. So just a starting point to start to identify where there might be some gaps or some overlap. So in general, I'll just go through the sort of big buckets. So the first one was policy. I'm noticing that there were several recommendations related to housing choice vouchers. So you'll notice that those are all grouped together. Recommendations for how to leverage those differently, to Dia's point, to potentially achieve better or different outcomes. One related to TOD and TIF, and then to streamlining permitting and review processes. The next kind of big bucket was related to capacity. So these are things that have to do with capacity within Metro or the mayor's office related to staffing, recommendation for an audit of Metro-owned land, a Department of Housing, Community Education Initiative, and then a comprehensive land study of land use policy, which you'll notice is also tied over to our planning and zoning category. So this covers study or a pilot project on gentle density, addressing exclusionary zoning, streamlining the rezoning process specifically for SPs, banning single family zoning, and then related to historic zoning and planning commissions review of adaptive reuse of existing buildings. The next big category was taxes and tax policy. One of the primary categories in there was pilots. So there were several recommendations for how to improve or better leverage that tool in particular. So expanding or creating a new type of pilot, a different form of tax abatement through transferring property ownership to the IDB or the Health Ed Housing Facilities Board, and then potentially using local sales tax exemption for purchasing materials. This was a little bit of a catch-all for new models. There were a couple of sort of distinct models for providing or creating housing, one being a municipal or city bank, and then the other referencing the Freedom House model. And then a category related to land, so especially the idea of equitable land disposition, whether through an RFP or some other process to leverage Metro land, either by private developers or as part of Metro investment in that kind of infrastructure. And then the last big category is funding. So again, several recommendations related to the Barnes Fund, some specifically referencing MDHA projects and procedures, and then the idea for different types of funding tools. So an acquisition and preservation fund, a funding pool to help cover infrastructure costs or subsidizing fees, and then expanding a bridge loan program or dedicated funding for shared equity models. So those were sort of the big buckets of ideas, and you can see that some of them are tied together. But would love to kind of open it up either, I guess, by category, if there are additional factors that we want to focus on, anything that you notice that's missing or that this might have sparked. And I'll add this live and then also into that SharePoint because you'll notice that these are really just the policy and that table has a lot more detail that we can continue to flesh out.
Kelsey, one recommendation that I'm not sure if I saw it, but it's probably here, was someone made a recommendation about establishing TOD districts and TIFs. And I couldn't believe that I forgot to add that to my list. So I just wanted to make, oh great, we have it.
I can see that Edward has his hand raised. Edward?
Thanks, Dia. It's easier when you do it and I don't have to do that. Thanks for recognizing me. Kelsey, the one thing that I had, this is not to steer our conversation just yet, but related to the categories of AMIs, with all AMI levels, is that essentially the 80 to 120? I just wanted, I know that that's also considered an area of affordable housing for Metro and Davidson County. So is that what we're representing here, or are we saying that we feel that that's included? I just want to say all AMIs is still inclusive of that 80 to 120.
Yeah, so there were several solutions that folks had noted as all under that AMI target. So those to me were things that didn't specifically serve one bracket or another. But for example, creating a Department of Housing would sort of by default affect any affordable housing that was created in the city, regardless of AMI. So that did capture the higher AMI levels, although there were no solutions specifically noted that were specific to the kind of 80 to 120 AMI.
Thank you.
So I'm checking for hands and I don't see any hands up. Oh, Hunter's hand just went up. Hunter, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it probably makes most sense for us to focus on, Kelsey, if you want to take a stab at this, at establishing like what are the easiest things to do, and then working from easiest to hardest, since our kind of like, marching orders were things that were easily attainable in the next 1 to 3 years. So while like we can have a spirited discussion around inclusionary zoning, I think that's probably not attainable in the next 3 years, given the state's current stance. So I don't think we should spend a bunch of time on that, but something along the lines of the specific recommendation from Dr. Shin of allocating, I think, twice the amount of going from 18 to 36 units from for the supportive services or the rapid rehousing. I'm not sure how she categorized that, but that seems pretty easy to do. That doesn't cost any money within like a certain specific or program that we already have. It seems like I feel like we should focus on the low hanging fruit first and then move from easiest to hardest. But that's just my idea. So curious, Dia or Kelsey, what you think about that.
I think that's great. And my only recommendation would be to do it by category. Kelsey, what do you think?
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I think maybe one way to frame that is what are the existing programs that we can potentially leverage differently or fix something about them in order to have a greater impact. So for example, housing choice vouchers is an existing tool, and potentially there's ways that we can change how we use it. Same thing with the Barnes Fund. Obviously that has a new infusion right now, but I think looking at ways to leverage existing tools, whether it's Barnes, pilots, housing choice vouchers in a different way, that seems to be one of those low-hanging fruit options. Because it already exists, we would just be changing how it functions. How does that sound to everybody?
That sounds great, Kelsey. Would you like to start on one of those?
I think we got a hand or two up, Dia.
Oh, Emily Thaden has her hand up. Emily? And Hunter, you do too, but I don't know if it's because you didn't pull your hand down.
Yeah, so I think that that's like a great approach that we can take. And the only thing I just want us to be mindful of is that, any change that we make to how we're doing something, right, in an existing format, it's actually having a consequence, right? So if we completely change how we're doing housing choice vouchers, then what has to come with that is like, how are we serving this need above 30% AMI for existing people, right? And so I just want to make sure that we also hold that discussion with how all of these solutions have to be attached together.
Thank you, Emily. Gina Emmanuel has her hand up.
I know that announcement tonight was about Barnes funding, which we were very happy to see that restored. There are quite a few comments about Barnes too, so I do agree with Hunter. Let's maybe, and Kelsey too, let's maybe take one of these and just start going through. There are quite a few for Barnes, and there are a few things, and we are lucky to have Ashley and Hannah on the phone tonight, and they can really talk to these pretty directly. And so, and I know Hannah was having Ashley too. It has increased our capacity, multiple folds. So some of these things that we have suggested a year ago, I would have thought there's no way we can do them. And now Ashley, not to pile more on your plate, but I think you have been able to do a lot of things that we've wanted to do. And so I think some of these things become more possible. So I would throw out a couple of these. And one of these we actually talked about at Barnes a couple of years ago, create a revolving revenue source within Barnes. A lot of our grantees have said, look, we are trying to fit these projects to a cycle. Real estate doesn't always happen on a cycle. We're missing out on deals because we cannot, we were waiting for a grant round. And if we were able to access a different way in a fund that sort of revolves throughout the year, if we can develop a criteria for how that can be done, it would be very beneficial to us. So that's one I think is potentially low hanging. I know there's a lot of, things Barnes would have to work out to be able to do that, but I think it would be very beneficial in the near term for producing more units.
And Gina, with that, you mean not that the money would come back, not revolving in that way, just revolving in that people could access it 12 months. Yep.
Yeah, it says revenue source. It should say, we're able to fund on a revolving way.
Gina, could you just clarify so I get the language on this right? Instead of create a revolving revenue source, it would
be able to
be
do revolving funding. So funding out of strict application round. So really year-round funding, if that's a way to say it. Not once a year funding.
Okay, got it.
Hunter, do you want to speak to your comment about better leveraging of Barnes funds? I'd love to, if there's specific thoughts you have about that, make sure that we capture them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, two things. I wanted to make a comment about the distinction that Gina just made right there, but I don't understand why Barnes funds wouldn't have a revolving aspect to it, both in terms of the application cycle, but also in the terms of at some point in time of the terminal end of the investment by the nonprofit, whether it be a sale of the property or something out way in the future, that the Barnes Fund wouldn't participate in what would be at that point in time a hopefully an increase in the equity of the property up until the point that it pays back the original investment. So it seems like we, when you get a home funds grant or a CDBG fund grant or a housing trust fund grant from other municipalities, most likely at some point in time, they want that loan, they want that money to come back to the housing trust fund to then leverage and use it again. Now that may be 30, 50, 60 years in the future, but effectively it's there to then re-lever and support more housing. So that's one thought. And then better leveraging, my part is like when I look, and historically Gina and I have had lots of conversations about this, but when I look at what the Barnes Fund has subsidized and on a per unit basis, outside of a few of the LIHTC deals that Urban Housing Solutions has done, the cost per unit is relatively very high. And Gina and I spent a bunch of time talking about targeting specific populations that are very expensive from a subsidy per unit perspective. But I also believe that it should be the fourth or fifth fund use of funds in the project that, if not but for the Barnes Fund, this deal happened. And in a lot of situations, it's the main driver of funds in the project. Love Danny Herron. Love Danny Herron, really do love him. But like a $1.1 million grant for 9 or 11 habitat houses just feels really expensive for a very vital resource that is very scarce, irregardless of the announcement today, very scarce. It just feels like we could leverage our dollars so much more to generate more units than what we have been historically. Now, it's in the most recent, but in just speaking historically before that. So I may be behind the time. So somebody slap my hand if I'm wrong. But that was my comment was specifically around that.
Yes, this is really crucial, and I'm really happy to have this conversation because the Barnes community has it all the time. And I think one of the advantages of having set funding, obviously for our grantees, is that they can start to plan ahead, but then we can also segment out the pool so that we say, you know, we're going to do this amount for, you know, capacity building. Obviously, like something we hear at council all the time is we don't want to just see the same grantees. So balancing that capacity building, home ownership is more expensive with obviously the huge challenge of units. I think if we could be more clear about how we're trying to do multiple things with the same pot of money, that would be really helpful. Because I think now that you mention it, we always talk about that it's leveraged, you know, 6-to-1, but then when you get into the numbers, if that's the number we're measuring ourselves by, then it makes it seem like that's all we care about, when really, you know, obviously there are other priorities that we have, but I think being more clear about that could help the grantees, the projects we see, and then of course the council conversation. That's really helpful.
I can see that Kelsey is adding Hunter's recommendations right now. So as members make recommendations, they will be added to this concept map, as well as the list of recommendations. We've got several hands up. Gina, would you like to go next, then Emily Thaden?
Sure, and piggybacking on what Hunter said, definitely agree. That is, like Hannah said, we talk about it all the time. I think one of the things also missing from Barnes when we're talking about this is, how do we create more units? I think we're also really just getting the applications, and while the applications may somewhat steer where the dollars are going, I think we need a better data set to really base what we are wanting those applications to fulfill, and that in turn may drive unit count, but really sort of focusing the funding rounds differently. Maybe this round is focused on unit count specifically. Maybe this round is focused on, TOD projects, or, there's a million different areas, but I think what we have suffered from a little bit is, we just did not have the capacity to really get that data to really drive the decisions to do that. And so, I think I've said this, I have put this a few times on the chart, just really having the data to make the right decisions. And I feel like in some ways, not doing it blindly, not saying we've been doing it blindly, but not more blindly than I would like without the data in front. That's why I appreciate all of these slides from Greg every week. It's just more to definitive information that we can make choices from.
Very good. And Kelsey, I think that the other thing I heard from Hunter was the concept of a revolving loan with a revenue stream attached to it. So I just want to be sure we're capturing people's ideas. Again, today is to get everything on the board and in the list. I'm going to go to Emily Thaden next.
Thanks, Thea. One thing that I've been really cautious of is, and I think somebody touched on this point, but I don't think that we can judge homeownership projects by rental standards. Just because there is not, you can't get LIHTC, you can't do all of these other, for all intents and purposes. And so when it comes to the homeownership side of the aisle, I would really like to see that the Barnes Fund actually has a permanent affordability requirement. And I think that should be the objective for everything, but there are some constraints in terms of requiring permanent affordability depending upon other funding sources when it comes to rental. But so, to Hunter's point about whether it's revolving loans, if, the way I see it is if we lock capital into properties that stay permanently affordable, we're helping more households, right? Because we're serving household after household in perpetuity. And the permanent affordability approach is so vital also to actually building inclusive communities over time. So even if, we're getting the affordable housing in more affordable places now, we've seen how much those places have changed in the last 20 years. And, if we had maintained our housing, our affordable housing stock in those places, we would have a lot of more economic and racial integration. So that's one I'd really like to see us consider. And sorry, the only other point I do want to make about Barnes Fund, I have just had the best luck in life to have been mentored by Mary Brooks, who's like the queen of all things housing trust fund. And, you know, I'm like channeling her right now where the number one thing she says is absolutely make sure that your housing trust fund is flexible. And so even though we want to set goals and be responsive to data, it really is supposed to be the gap filler or the thing that, but for, you know, your flexible local dollars, you're just not going to be able to make it happen. And so that's, you know, I just have that in the back of my brain with, you know, when we're trying to set priorities to not make it too complicated, which is why I also love the idea of like, let's make sure that people can access those funds when they need to so that they can be bringing down the federal home loan bank funds or, you know, that kind of thing.
Emily, this is Hunter. To piggyback off that, there is a great shared equity model that already exists in Nashville with the housing fund on row 812, which is those row homes that are across the street from the farmers market on Rosa Parks. And those have a shared equity model that the housing fund operates on. I completely agree with your comments. Like if we're going to subsidize home ownership, which is a very expensive endeavor, then we should ensure the affordability in perpetuity and it not just be like a one-time thing. And then if, you know, somebody sells and makes $1 million or the price rises and that home is no longer affordable. Not saying that that's the case, but just thinking through the life of a city is much longer than the life of you and I or anybody else here. And so just thinking through that, I agree with your comments.
And I don't see another hand up, so I don't think I'm jumping in front of anybody. But I was gonna literally, you know, say some of the things that Hunter just said. But another great example of properties, Chestnut Road, which are in the Chestnut Hill area, actually sitting in one of those townhomes right now. That is a shared equity product. And I think the point I was going to make is if we do carry the homeownership and the permanent affordability, there does need to be an agent that is empowered to steward them, right? So it can't be a traditional home ownership type of process where the project is funded, the sales are made, and then, you know, you have just homeowners kind of disjointedly able to sell their property. I think there does need to be a stewardship component to it. So I just think it needs to be taken into consideration of who and how the funds are accessed.
Okay, I do not see other hands. And I just want to remind members, I was just emailed by one, that if you do not see your recommendation here, I know there were a lot on the preservation subcommittee. So depending on how you have been coordinating with your colleagues, it might have ended up on the preservation subcommittee list. So if you feel that you have creation items, that is new construction or production items of units that you would like to see on this concept map and in this list, please be sure to add them as Kelsey moves through the categories. So Kelsey, just real quick, Hunter raised a value, which is affordability in perpetuity. You know, I definitely think we should just get that on just maybe around the Barnes Fund, or in a value if you want to put it in the middle, but just have that there. You know, I think there's a lot of discussion about the length of affordability, the duration of that affordability. So I think that will need to be examined as we move forward. And then with that one, Kelsey, please feel free to move forward to the next category. I do not see any other hands up at this point.
I know that we talked specifically about Barnes under the funding bucket. Do we want to go through the other funding solutions while we're here?
Mr. Alexander has his hand up. I think that's a yes.
Sure. So in thinking about the funding recommendation to create a bridge loan for nonprofit developers to acquire land or to finance pre-development expenses until they can apply for financing for their projects. to help that become a little bit more cost neutral, maybe an initial approach is to approach local banks and lending institutions to see if they can create a product that would work for nonprofit developers before asking Metro to make the initial seed investment.
Good deal. Hunter.
Hey, Emil, the housing fund, which is a CDFI here in town, I'm not sure about Pathway, but the housing fund will do that today with their capital they have. They'll do it both for-profit and nonprofit developers. As someone who has been both on the board of the housing fund and as a borrower to take down land for affordable housing that we couldn't get land contracts extended, they have that kind of capacity and have a program around that specifically. It just probably, based on your comment, it's just probably not well publicized, and that's something that they could fix. And Marshall Crawford, who's the CEO of the housing fund, is a task force member as well.
Great.
And we can coordinate that offline because Marshall's on the preservation subcommittee. Councilwoman Swara.
Hi, let me say that Kelsey did a wonderful job. I need to learn how to use this app. Very well coordinated. On my recommendations here, I think there might be something that is similar. It might be something that will take off the task force and put under the council or maybe on the some other place. But basically, what happened is. Specifically with the water bill that just went up, I got a call from one of the developer saying that, look, we get our funds from Metro, but Metro always find a way to get those back in some other ways. And in looking at how to resolve that issue in terms of how can we lower the water bill or any other bill that we have for developers is where this idea came forward, because the water department cannot charge a different rate to anyone for any reason. And so the recommendation that the council legal office and the water department came up with is, why don't we have a set-aside fund where we can actually help with construction costs, the fee part of it, to be able to address this. My understanding is that as a council member, Metro Council can do this in the next upcoming budget, and the mayor can also do it in his budget. The mayor's already set aside some money in the capital spending fund for housing infrastructure. But I think that any amount that we can get, and if I'm able to convince some of my colleagues to add something to this where we can reimburse fees, whether it's permit fees, whether it's water fees, whether it's any construction fees, will be not a lot, but I think it will still be something that we should be willing to do. So I would say it's a needed idea, but even if it's not one that the task force want to pursue, it's one that I'll be more than happy to take back to the budget process and undo with my colleagues if we can get something there.
Thank you, Councilwoman Swara. We have Emily Thaden back up.
I just had a question related to that, and Hunter might be the best person to answer it, but how much, I mean, I just don't know in terms of the fees that we're charging as a city, how much is that actually moving the needle in terms of cost? Like, how substantial could that be in terms of making projects work that otherwise would not?
It's gotten really expensive now, Emily. Like Metro Water Services just about tripled their tap fee to about $3,000 a unit is what we're paying. So it ends up being pretty significant, especially if you're talking about a large scale development or even like a large home development. So it's like, for a project that's 200 units, you're talking about almost $600,000 in tap fees. Oh, and by the way, Metro Water also wants you to do public improvements as well to the stormwater system. So it doesn't you pay the fee and you don't then have to do offsite work as well. The one thing I will say as it relates to that is I know that Metro Water Services can't waive fees because of their bonding. We've looked at that, or that's been looked at before, but maybe Metro can grant back the money to a project that meets different AMI levels. And in Austin, which is a comparable city, if you hit, I think if it's 10 or 20% of your units are targeted at 50% AMI or less, the city of Austin will waive your tap fees from that perspective. So it's targeted. The fee waiver is targeted, but it's actually lower than just a standard 60% unit. It's 20% at 50. So I don't know, just something worth noting of another municipality.
Yeah, I wanted to dovetail with what Hunter was saying from a smaller scale. I mean, the cost per unit is uniform across the board, and so it does tally to a really high figure when you're thinking about larger multifamily. But the public infrastructure piece, some would argue, I might be one of those people, that it disproportionately impacts the smaller scale, right? So when you're trying to absorb the infrastructure cost, I think Eddie would jump in and probably say the same thing if he was on here. So I think just both from the impact from tap fees as well as the infrastructure upgrades, I think are both significant.
Very good. Gina Emanuel has her hand up.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what Ed and Hunter are saying, and I spoke a little earlier with Hannah about this also. We've had some grantees where the infrastructure costs are a really high percentage of their build cost, and more and more lately as those costs have increased, and it does make it more difficult. I mean, that's just dollars going away from your construction, and construction is expensive right now anyway. So I do think if there's a way, I love those suggestions you had, Hunter, of ways to help deal with those fees, because they can be enormous. If you are providing a certain amount of affordability in your project, there should be a way, to make that easier to do instead of more difficult.
Very good. Hannah.
I actually am so glad that Council Spora sort of led into the participation agreements, because I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but Mayor Cooper did include in his most recent CFP $2 million for participation agreements with affordable housing projects. It's left pretty broad at this point, but if anyone is interested in talking through how we could best utilize those, please email me. We can set up a little small working group. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with participation agreements, they've traditionally been used for economic development deals. The most notable one, Amazon, to update some of the water infrastructure downtown. But as Gina had mentioned, we're seeing that, of course, a lot with Barnes. I'm having conversations with a lot of you on the development side, because I know how challenging that is. So while we might not be able to do things as flexible as we want with state law, especially on what you're talking about, Hunter, with building into the public infrastructure, we want to have updated infrastructure, obviously, but where we can, Metro wants to help pay for it so that it's not impacting our ability to have affordable development.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm checking the list and I don't see hands, but hang on a second, Kelsey. There are a couple of folks I just want to check in with, and I'd like to see how Kia Jarman and Dr. Coleman are doing and see if they have any comments or additions or questions.
I'm doing fine. I had sent in some recommendations, and I think they may have been incorporated into creation. Perhaps I didn't make and I worked with the people on the creation. One thing that was mentioned was the Industrial Development Board, and I don't recall what the particular recommendation was, and it's too small for me to read. So would you mind repeating that, Kelsey?
Yeah, that was from Councilmember Suara, a recommendation to explore tax abatement through transfer of property ownership to the IDB or the Health and Ed Board. So it's an alternative to the pilot. Rather than transferring ownership to MDHA, it would transfer ownership to the IDB or Health and Ed Board.
I'm not sure what would be the advantages of that, because the IDB does have the capacity to do affordable housing already, and they've only done one unit of which I'm aware. So somehow to activate that would be beneficial, I think.
If I may?
Yes, Councilwoman Suara, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, so these actually came about when I was trying to look for a way to help residents abate their taxes, property taxes, because it was going up so high. And in talking to the state legislators, there's actually a white paper written on this that says that within the state code, within the state regulation, we can use IDB, just like we use in MDHA, to be able to have people transfer their property to IDB. And then once IDB owns the property, then it will be tax-free as long as it's under IDB ownership. And so I think this is something we've not explored very well, and I think it's something we should. And what I love about it is that because it's already part of the state code, then we won't run into state preemption or can we do this, can we not do this? The state said we can. And at first, I wasn't sure we could because I was worried that property owners may not want to relinquish ownership. But then in talking to Kelsey and people on the development side, developers are doing that already with MDHA. And so this is another avenue that allows us, whether with creation or even preservation, people that got LIHTC, but the LIHTC period is over, there is a point where we can transfer those new properties to IDB. As long as IDB owns it, then it will be tax-free. And it is for profit, non-profit, any kind of property that we can do this with. And I think that it's an idea that we should look into. I think there's a group that is already looking, and I think we probably can do this in the next year or two. The reservation that I've heard is in terms of costs. You have to structure the legal terms in such a way that it does not come back on you, where you still have to pay the taxes. But other than the legal cost of setting it up, the mechanism is already there. And we can use that our MDHA one. We can look at the state code. We can bring all the attorneys together. If we can get this done in a year or so, I think we can have more buildings with this.
Hunter has his hand up. Hunter?
Yeah, we actually have somebody on the task force tonight who knows a little bit something about pilots and how that process works. Dwayne, can you actually go back in time and completely abate the taxes, or are you just locking in the tax rate today? I'm curious if you can go back and like make a tax rate 0 for a property that's already been placed in service.
If you're going to transfer ownership to a tax exempt entity, then as of the year of the transfer, going forward, you can essentially affect an abatement, but not necessarily going back. But the transfer of the ownership to the tax exempt entity that dictates when the exemption kicks in. But the whole notion of transferring property to the IDB or the Health and Ed Board, and then having those tax exempt entities basically lease or sublease those properties back out to others for affordable housing purposes is another way of kind of like affecting a community land trust or land bank that can significantly help with affordable home ownership. That may be something to throw up on the board as well.
Dwayne, could you talk a little bit about the land bank, land trust idea? I know from the, Board of Health perspective, I don't think the Board of Health sees its role directly as being an owner of affordable housing. So I don't want to speak on behalf of them. I'm their liaison, but I think it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about land banks and land trusts.
Are you speaking kind of broadly, like how they affect, like in some other jurisdictions where they use them both as a resource and as a development arm? Or I know the Health and Ed Board, but locally is not looking to become a development arm. On the other hand, the Health and Ed Board also is very flexible and works well with the Metro Council, such that if Metro Council comes or the city comes and says, hey, we want you to act like a land bank moving forward, and we want you to essentially facilitate an exemption for these properties moving forward that will be designated by this other subcommittee, then I would think that the Health and Ed Board would be more than accommodating to help facilitate a land trust or a land bank that somebody like the Housing Fund could facilitate, or New Level, I think at some point had looked into possibly being the custodian of a program such as that.
So what would that look like under a land bank or a land trust?
Can I chime in here? So in terms of land banks, typically they have authorities that we don't currently have under state laws, my understanding. So land banks have more authority to deal with like clearing property tax delinquencies, clearing title, and they're doing a lot of the work behind the scenes to get it so that then they can be disposing of land through different purposes. And so you need them to have certain authorities to be most effective. And so land banks, when they are funded, we're seeing them increasingly make sure that they aren't just thinking about putting land back into use, but they're thinking about equitable land use. So, but that takes funding in order for them to do that. And some of them are even proactively targeting acquiring properties for affordable housing development. So, for instance, we're working right now in Atlanta, Houston, and Portland to create a land bank that then funnels the pipeline of properties to the community land trust. So the land bank basically clears title and effectively gives the land over to the community land trust. The community land trust then develops the housing and holds that affordable housing in perpetuity. So they're complementary tools, but they're different.
Yeah, I agree that you got to have a funding source with respect to the land bank and helping to facilitate the development. When we did this in Memphis in the early 2000s, they helped the land bank in Memphis through its initial development through CDBG and home funds, and then it stocked itself with units that could then generate some revenue that made it easier when a developer with a Hope 6 transaction, for example, needed land, needed it to be cleared out before it would come in to or be used by it. So it wasn't where the state had actually blessed it, which wasn't going to happen in Memphis, but they did find a way to fund the land bank, and the land bank did both development, and it helped facilitate the others in the development of affordable housing. Hunter is on this. I know he's worked with the land bank in Memphis with respect to troubled properties.
I say the Memphis Land Bank run by Marty Regan in Memphis has done a great job of taking both troubled properties and what were under or areas of revitalization that needed to happen, and then also to helping clear environmental issues with TDEC prior to selling the property, which is probably the greatest hurdle to developing in downtown Memphis is its historical industrial use. And so, but they were able to provide us clear title, Emily, through some sort of process that may not have been as clean as what you're referencing to, but they were able to kind of tackle that with us at the same time. And the Memphis Land Bank is actually a client of Dwayne, so he's much more knowledgeable on this issue than I am.
It is an entity that it's a 501c3. It was created by affiliates of the city with strong personalities on the board. As Hunter mentioned, Marty Regan is one. Robert Lipscomb, who at the time wore 3 different hats in the city. I mean, somebody that was influential who could help facilitate the development and the direction of it. Of the land bank. So, it's not out of reach for the city of Nashville to do.
Very good. Councilwoman Suara has her hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation around the land use of the land bank, and I think that that could go in tandem with my recommendation. But I want us to know that when I'm talking about the situations where we have for-profit developers that wants to get into affordable housing, but we're not doing light tech or pilot with them, they could pretty much fund the house, build it, and then at the point where it's finished, they know that they can transfer it to the IDB. And IDB takes ownership and then lease it back to them. So that's what I have in mind in making this recommendation. That so the board would not have to worry about funding the building itself. The project will be funded by the developer with the understanding that they will have their taxes abated, and that once they build it, they will not be paying all these property taxes for X number of years. And so that's the angle that I want us to put into all of this conversation as well. So,
Hunter, your hand is up. Hunter, you're still on mute. Did you mean to make a statement, or is your okay? Now I can.
No. Well, actually, I was going to say there is flexibility in the pilot structure that exists today. We've had conversations about not being able to use pilots for projects that aren't that don't utilize LIHTCs and things like that. But the Memphis pilot as it exists and is utilized by the Memphis for any project be
Hunter, you're breaking up. Do you want to try
sort of
again?
federal assessment, whether it utilizes it or not. So either 20% at 50 or 40% at 60 can utilize the tax abatement program. I think that, yeah, I'll try it later. But I was going to tell Councilwoman, as far as I could, that we already got authority to change the pilot program in Davidson County. Can you hear me now?
So we want to, yeah, can you say that again?
Yeah.
You're coming through clear.
I'm sorry. I was going to say that the pilot program as it exists today in other cities, take Memphis or Chattanooga, Memphis allows you to get a pilot if you either hit 40% of your units at 60 or 20% of your units at 50, irregardless if you use LIHTCs or not. So it's just a change of the pilot statute or ordinance that we have locally and how the program is funded and I think Chattanooga's pilot even allows for projects that are at least 50% of its units target 80% AMI or less. I think that's the parameters around their pilot program. And however, their terms are much longer. Memphis's is 20 years and Chattanooga's is 15. So it has for wider flexibility and longer term. So that's one thing I would note.
Kelsey is doing a fabulous job making a notation on that. Dwayne, did you want to go ahead?
I think since Hunter brought up the notion of increasing the pilot terms, then we should explore possibly going beyond just the terms that are associated with low-income housing tax credit transactions of 10 years or 15 years. As he mentioned, Memphis has pilots that go up 20 years. I think that notion should be explored too, just because it should help facilitate more units.
Okay, Kelsey is capturing that idea.
I have a clarifying question.
Yep, go right ahead.
If a pilot expires after 10 years in Davidson County, are projects eligible to reapply for a new pilot, or is it a one-time only deal?
My understanding is it's one time only, and that's a problem that Memphis faced a number of years ago, and they had to figure out a way to allow existing projects to come back into programs.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Dwayne, do you know off the top of your head how Memphis got existing programs back into existing properties back into programs? They
required a minimum amount of reinvestment in the properties in order to qualify for an additional pilot. But in the tax credit industry, it would be like a resyndication, a year 15 transaction in which you go back into the bond and tax credit program and get another refinancing. And then you're able to commit $30, $40, or $50,000 a unit in rehab to upgrade the property in exchange for the tax abatement.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. I do not see any other hands up. So far we've covered Barnes, and I believe this topic is pilot or tax credits. I can't tell because we're not quite there. So Kelsey, when you're ready, we can move to either another tab or another topic as you see the need for.
Sure. Oh, yep. Okay. So I think that was really helpful to touch on some of the pilot recommendations. The only other tax related recommendation that hasn't yet been discussed, at least kind of adjacent, is the recommendation from Hunter for utilization of low exemption for construction materials. Hunter, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that anymore.
Yeah, I'm doing the exact opposite of what Dia said, and the people who talk to listen more. So I'm going to go ahead and just apologize, blanket apology about that. But this was something that the city of Austin is, and Dwayne mentioned on a previous call, has been very aggressive about utilizing, and they offer a sales tax exemption for materials that are acquired in the state of Texas. They utilize their sales tax exemption from the housing authority's perspective. They are the quote unquote GC on the project in order to qualify for the tax abatement, and then they just sub down to one sub and pass off all the risk to that sub, but effectively ends up being about a 5% savings on construction cost in total. And then the Travis County or HACA, the Housing Authority of Austin, charges about a 1.5% of that 5% savings. So it ends up being several $100,000 per project that they're able to generate themselves in free cash flow, but also thus saving the project additional funds as well. It also ensures that it's an economic development vehicle too, because it keeps the material purchases as much as possibly can in the state. So.
Okay. Councilwoman Suara.
Yes, I love the idea. My question to Hunter is, would this be decided at the state level?
I'm not certain. I've mentioned it to Matt Wilshire just broadly and NBA sales for your materials on your Vision KC or Red Oak townhomes or whatever project they're building, like you should be. So I'm not sure. I haven't gotten that far. If not, but if anything, Councilwoman, like it could be for any materials purchased in Davidson County, and we could abate the local sales tax perspective. Because if you think about just components like fixtures and appliances, all that stuff can be bought from a local vendor, whether it be Ferguson or somebody else, that could then thus have savings associated with it that can then fund MDHA or another thing and pass the savings on. But that's just my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, I think it's worth exploring, and we should. And if it's something that we can take care of locally, we should. It seems like a no-brainer. And if it's working with the state, then we'll jump on that too. So thanks.
Very good. So I think we want to be sure we're flagging areas where we might need some more research or information. We have a couple of attorneys around the table. Maybe we'll have them take a look at some of these policy issues. With that, I just want to take a minute to check in with Kia Jarman. We're at 6:10 right now, according to my clock, and I just want to check in with folks who haven't had a chance to speak with us tonight.
Thank you, Dia. I appreciate that. You know, I don't have a lot of things to add on the technical end because a lot of my work is people centered, and though I've worked on zoning processes and things like that, I'll let the technical experts manage that. What I do want to maybe call to our attention or think through is as I look at the colors on this, I don't see a lot in one of the high priority areas that I believe we need to be maybe get a little clearer about, which is our 30% AMI group. And so just as we're looking at some of these items and areas, you know, or 0 to 30%, how do we make sure that we're ensuring not just all AMI levels, but really those who dangle in the margins are considered? And I believe we all want to do that, but this is the time to do that. And then the other piece is as we look at this, and again, everyone on here has some technical expertise. I do want to make sure that we're looking at these policies, the taxes, the financing, all of those things through the lens of what has historically been harmful, may seem helpful, but may be also very harmful. And in some instances, things appear to be very helpful to certain communities, but then we know that they are harmful. So I don't have the answers there. I just pose questions to make sure that we're thinking about how this actually gets translated into community, how it lives out, and how we make sure there's no unintended harmfulness that happens to communities. Because some of these things are great, but to be very honest with you, traditionally, this is where those people who are from Nashville, like myself, Black and Indigenous people, people with disabilities, people who are often hanging out in the margins, don't get an opportunity to be in affordable spaces. And so I want to just make sure of that. So again, I pose that as a question and concern and highlight for us to make sure as we're looking at this, we're thinking about that as well.
These are really critical questions to ask, and I'm going to tap my colleague Hannah to, as we move forward with these discussions, if we can, you know, identify a couple of task force members who have some knowledge in the issue of previously harmful policies on people of color and communities, low income communities. I think that's going to be important as we move forward. I'd also like to add that Dr. Shin, Beth Shin, was not able to be with us tonight due to a family emergency. Kia and Kelsey, would you be willing to follow up with her? She certainly has provided her expertise on populations at and below 30% of AMI. I know she wanted to be here tonight and would welcome an update from you too. Certainly our conversation next week will pick up where we left off this week, so she'll have a chance to contribute, but I think it would be great to circle back with her. Okay, Kelsey, I'm turning it back to you.
Great. I did want to make sure that we touch on some of the suggestions in the planning and zoning category. Just as a kind of recap of those, dealing with exclusionary zoning, including single family zoning, and then about process. So a streamlined process for rezoning, especially related to SPs, and then approvals of adaptive reuse of existing structures. Both of those suggestions came from Mr. Henley. So I don't know if you want to jump in and elaborate on any of those, or Emily or Gina related to your suggestions.
Edward,
Ed, I will love to hear from Ed and maybe even Kia on this one as well, because what came to mind, Kia, as you were sharing that, is that there can be such a push to, like, let's go, let's streamline, let's move, because we know these units are needed yesterday. So I'm interested in how we can, and I know some of our communities feel like they've shared their feelings at community meetings and they saw nothing of it. So balancing that trust deficit that we're at, So I'd like to hear the technical side from Ed, but then also Kia, if you could share about sort of, and maybe this comes offline, but what are ways that we can both be really productive in the way we move in a way that respects the community, so that we're not just pushing full steam ahead.
Oh, really quick, I had a call come in, so it cut out my audio. So if there's a direct question for me, can it be asked again? I do apologize.
Edward, I think we really want you to talk a little bit about your ideas here that are on the board, and then Hannah had some additional questions for you.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I'll start work from left to right with the Historic Zoning Planning Commission. I think with that one, just having conversations and really talking with folks in other cities. One of the things that they've done is repurpose facilities, structures that are historic that really have a hard time gaining traction as some form of new life when there's a lot of restrictions around the way that the structure needs to be preserved from the exterior, but they don't have many restrictions from an interior standpoint. And so if there are opportunities like that for the city to look at those being designated for affordable housing. Also, when you have communities that have unique scale and size of housing, I touched on this a little bit earlier in the preservation committee, Dia. There's an opportunity to allow for them to be divided into multiple units to create more affordability. Sometimes there's neighborhoods where there's 15 to 20 relatively historic and character appropriate homes that are larger, but there's only one or two of them that are grandfathered in, so to speak, as duplexes or triplexes or quads, and so just really allowing that to be an option for developers or redevelopment of those areas. And then again, thinking about converting housing, if it may not be in the current zoning, but if you have a large enough lot to allow for whether it be an addition, a modification to the home, providing a different entranceway or drive access, so that you're able to, as best as possible, meet the character of a community or a neighborhood, but then still understand that the modification is happening for a greater good. So that's really what the comment around the different commissions being more, I guess, open-minded or having some flexibility, very similar to what was mentioned by Emily earlier about your fund, right? I think also being more flexible about your regulations that are very hard and strict as we have a crisis to attend to. The comment about the streamlined process for rezoning or utilizing an NSP. Just thinking about the tools that we have, and currently there are several processes that you have to go through, particularly if you're in a certain neighborhood characteristic in the community plan. There's a lot of levers. One being a plan amendment, which a lot of times takes quite a bit of time and often multiple community meetings, and not necessarily being anti-community meeting, but if they can be done quickly and serve multiple purposes, both for the community plan as well as any particular project, I think there's some streamlining and synergies that can happen there. And again, these are processes that take quite a bit of time to go through planning. Not that nothing really goes through there quickly now because of the burden that we understand they have, but I think there's an opportunity for there to be assistance from a potential, a housing department or having a designated liaison that can say, here are the core or key things that really will make this project be seen favorably by the city or by planning, and really just equipping our developers with a toolkit and some insight into what would be most beneficial for them to do on the front end. Because a lot of times I think these projects are avoided because they're either complex, they're unfamiliar, or they're seen as a time suck with minimal value. And so they're just avoided. And that's not something that I don't think it's an environment that will create the kind of outcomes that we want.
Thank you, Edward. Hannah, do you want to recap your question?
For the sake of time, I think I'll just get a couple of you all that have said you're interested together on sort of that community planning, Ed and Kia, and a couple of other of you that have sort of mentioned it.
Good deal. And we look forward to those recommendations on the next meeting. Okay. Kelsey.
Hannah did remind me earlier something that I feel like I advocate for often and inadvertently did not put on the list, to evaluate our parking requirements, because parking tends to be a rather expensive piece of development and not always the highest and best use of either land or resources. So I'm just going to add that. Anything else on the planning and zoning category?
Kelsey, one last thing I would add, just because it's a current situation. I think along with zoning and planning is this, the state is about to sell 2 parcels on 2nd Avenue North. I'm not sure if any of y'all have seen this. It's just literally a block west of the new baseball stadium, the Sound Stadium. It's fairly large parcel. It's 6 acres. Like it's DTC zoning, so it's going to be for whatever anybody essentially wants to build, which is where the value in it is, which is why the estimated sales price is in the tens of millions of dollars for that 6 acres. It'd be great if we could somehow coordinate with the state that when they sell property in the downtown core, that we can hopefully help them push affordability as part of that. So just given that the zoning there is so huge, I was afraid I'd forget about that if I didn't mention that when you said zoning. So I'm sorry for jumping in there.
Did you say that's already been sold, Hunter, or it's coming up?
No, it's now on the market. The state is now brokering it, or they're now calling out for offers right now. I'm happy to share that with whomever needs it or whoever was asking.
Thank you.
That was Hannah. So definitely send it Hannah's way. Greg Claxton is up on deck. Did we lose you, Greg?
I muted a second time. I apologize. In the category of planning and zoning, thinking about the metro parking requirements, I think one thing to maybe broaden that a little bit is to look for opportunities for incentives that are compliant with current state law. I kind of think parking might be one of those where it's not an entitlement. Arguably there might be some room to maneuver there. I think there may be other things we can do as well. So just sort of being mindful that there may be things we can do now. I think let me see. I think I'll reserve some of my more detailed comments for the more detailed discussion on planning and zoning. But I'd love to be part of that because I think there's opportunities to do stuff, particularly if we kind of reframe and think about some of the long-term tools we have. Thanks.
Excellent. I tell you what, can we have a show of virtual hands of how many folks would like to be tapped for an offline discussion on parking and zoning? I've got Edward Henley and of course Kia Jarman, Gina Emanuel, Greg Claxton, Hunter Nelson. So that's who we've got. For the small group on planning and zoning is Kia Jarman, Hunter Nelson, Greg Claxton, Gina Emanuel, and Edward Henley. So we look forward to your recommendations next week as we reconvene and hear from you about what some of the new ideas are. Kelsey, where are we at? Give us an update. We've got 6 minutes.
So the only one that we haven't really discussed at all is this capacity question, which might not be exactly the right word to describe these kind of initiatives that are a little more indirect, but no less valuable. So a lot of them have to do with staffing within the mayor's office, creating a Department of Housing, working on this community education initiative. Ed's point about creating a developer and agency list or forum. So if there's anything to elaborate on any of those, or a suggestion for a different word than capacity.
Emil Alexander has his hand up.
Sure, just one suggestion that has been said before that may tie into capacity is adding a central dashboard to track the progress on the creation of new affordable housing. And this is something that may tie into the Department of Affordable Housing, something that's sort of real time so that we know where projects are in the development phase.
Amal, I'm
Are there-
wondering if
Mhm.
Venture has the development tracker. I'm wondering if those tools might be aligned or if this needs to be a separate function.
I think if you could put as many things on that tracker, I think it would be more helpful for people to go to one place. Because now I think even with the tracker, there's still a lot of different places that you have to go to find things. So I think that's a good suggestion, Kelsey.
Edward Henley has his hand up. Edward, your mic's off.
Yeah, okay. I think we're good now. I was gonna say, I think the value of a developer agency forum is already shown value based on Hannah's desire to have more detailed conversations. But I also think it's an equity initiative and strategy as well, because there are a lot of folks that, again, are in the space that want to do the type of work that we're talking about, that don't necessarily have the inroads to Metro, don't have the resources, and also, again, that toolkit that I'm talking about is something that will help a lot of people. I think this is an enemy or a problem that we can kill by 1,000 cuts, and so the more change agents and people that we have working in that space, as we create capacity there by giving them the education and the resources, we just serve ourselves better for the future.
So Edward, can you speak a little bit more? Are you thinking of a specifically like a capacity building program, or are you thinking more of sort of regular dialogues to point out areas where policy has to change?
I think both. I think the reason why I say making it equitable is if you put someone like Hunter in the room, we pick on Hunter a lot, but he's here, and so I know he doesn't mind. He's able to really lean in on the type of discussions we're having about the policy and changes and national objectives that are working, and then you have people that are potentially more homegrown that can learn from Hunter's comments, but also can say, here are the struggles I'm facing, right? I go to this church and they have property, they want to do X, and we don't know how to get it done. Who are the other agencies that can help, right? Where the funds at, where the grants, how can we create 8 homes, relatively easily with the city's help, right? Different scales are all part of that conversation. So I think across the board, I think it would be both education as well as just interaction.
Good deal. So you do see education and technical assistance a part of that. That's important to note. Councilwoman Swara has her hand up.
No, I'm here.
Okay, we're glad you're back.
Thank you. I just wanted to add real quickly, actually, there was a conversation today and even in several spaces about minority developers not being able to take advantage of some of the things that are happening. And part of that is that, we're following the rules, we're doing what we need to do, but people don't know that they could use this. And so the forum that Edward is talking about is not just only education, but it allows us to be able to have access. And so that way you can build that into, so it wouldn't be, we put this stuff out, but nobody responded, or we didn't have minority people come forward. Having that forum will be a place to be able to actually find the people and for the people to also find the resources. And I think that speaks more to access. So great idea.
Excellent. So according to my clock, we are now at 6:30. What I'd like to do is just have Kelsey give us just a quick summary of where we stand. What's going to happen next is that these changes will be added to the list as well. And I think that Kelsey, you'll have to let us know if you can release or just share the link to the Miro so that folks can take a look at the recommendations on their own to see what else they might want to add. But Kelsey, why don't you close us up with a summary of where we're at?
Sure. And yes, I can both send the link and export this as individual boards. So just kind of big picture items. We had the comment about affordability in perpetuity, and then also Kia's helpful reminder to be mindful of the potential unintended harm that any of these policies or tools might cause. We had a really great discussion about the Barnes Fund and some potential levers to pull there, as well as a bridge loan program to allocating funds to help subsidize fees as a workaround for not being able to provide fee waivers. We talked a little bit about land banking and opportunities related to equitable land disposition. Had some great conversation about pilots and some of the technical details that we might be able to look to places like Memphis to improve our pilot program here in Nashville. Conversations related to zoning solutions, and we have our list of folks who are going to really dig into that ahead of next week. A brief conversation about capacity within the city, especially related to that developer and agency forum to help connect people both to each other and to resources. And then the one space that I think we can still dig into more over the next week and on our next call is this policy, especially related to housing choice vouchers. I do want to remind folks of Emily's comment that as we allocate resources differently, we need to be mindful of what we're removing and ways to fill the gaps that we will be creating in that process.
Good deal. I have 4 next steps. So we look forward to hearing from the Planning and Zoning subcommittee. We're going to talk about housing choice vouchers next week. So if folks have comments, recommendations, additional items for the housing choice voucher topic, let's look at that. Kia and Kelsey are going to catch up with Dr. Shin to be sure we really capture her expertise around the 30% and below population. And then we want to take into consideration trade-offs. So if we do, realign any resource, what is the trade-off for doing that? So next week, we will also be looking at building out themes to help to get us into some strategies. So until then, I hope everybody stays healthy and well, and we look forward to seeing you at the same bat time and the same bat place next Thursday, the 18th. Take care, everyone.